Welcome to Know What I Mean. My name's Oscar.
My name is George, and I was just about to say welcome to welcome to Know What I Mean as Oscar said it. So I was kind of like half mouthing it, but you beat me to it.
You can see that on the YouTube.
Yeah.
It's quite funny.
Yeah, this was a really fun episode. I feel like it took a little while kind of getting warmed up and like really getting into it, because we're talking about some things that can kind of seem abstract but are actually very practical. And I think we've really managed to take it to a very practical place at the end. And I think it's definitely worth sticking with it, because it will get to that place, even if it does seem like we're kind of going on some more like abstract spiritual things that might seem just a bit weird, or like there's not really that useful or whatever it is. So yeah, I would really recommend sticking with it, because I think we did bring it round at the end to something very practical and very important.
Yeah, I just agree with what Joe said there, really. I think, as you'll see, like it is literally just like it's a quite sticky, difficult topic to really put into words. And so, yeah, you have to kind of catch the wind with it. You know, like if you're sailing, it's kind of like you might just kind of get a moment of inspiration and you can kind of go with that, and that makes more sense. But I think initially we were just kind of we were sort of like just padding around trying to like find a sort of I don't know, find the root of it. But I hope you enjoy that anyway. Yeah, hope you enjoy the episode.
Let's get into it.
The quote for this week is by a spiritual teacher, Adyashanti, one of my faves. The quote is, "What is what's happening before you have the thought about it." As I mentioned last week, I picked this quote because I'm interested in, well, encouraging exploration of this area, really. So it's kind of like how I've often heard it mentioned that with writing books, for example, you pick to write a book that you really want to read, and you don't necessarily write about the thing that you know the absolute most about all the time. It can be stuff that you actually just want to know more about and you want to research about. Same with like public speaking or doing talks or leading workshops. It's like, it's actually the teaching or talking about something is educational in itself for you. You know, it doesn't mean that you're an absolute master in something. It can be very informative to actually have to structure a sentence, structure talk, structure a book, blog post, whatever. And so this week's quote feels like one of those quotes of something that it's not been a theme, this area recently, other than in the last week when I've been thinking about this quite a lot, but it's something that I was just thinking, oh, I really want to look into this more. So to dismantle what's being said here, as far as I can understand, when Adyashanti says what is what's happening before you have a thought about it, what he's referring to when he says what is raw sense experience, really the fundamental baseline experience of what's happening before interpretation, before the overlay of conceptual models, before all of that, like what is actually here. And the way that I've generally split the usual way of thinking and perceiving and what he's referring to here, I'd refer to that as being direct experience. So you've got this different way of perceiving the world. You've got your direct experience and you've got your usual kind of conceptual overlay interpretation of what's going on. So they're kind of different ways of being. And it's really interesting because I've led quite a few things at the Manchester Buddhist Centre on, you know, doing different sessions, trying to walk through, because so much of Buddhism really is about experience, is about how you relate to the world. And one of the things that I find really interesting is how difficult it is to actually understand this idea of direct experience. Like it's almost a bit like a riddle. So how I describe it really is if you right now, if you look at what's in front of you, so you might just pick an object. Your direct experience is your sense experience for that object, like the color, the shade, the tone of that object in front of you. Your conceptual model is your label of that object. So for example, right now, I'm looking at a laptop. That's my label. That's my thought of what this is. My direct experience of the laptop, in quotations, is like a very dark shade next to a lighter shade. There's some gradients. There is what seems like kind of shadow. It's actually a lot of different colors and things going on. That's my sense experience of that. And that's my direct experience of what's in front of me. So that's the distinguishing factor, is what's your direct sensory experience, your direct experience, and what is a label. And so what Adyashanti is talking about here, I think, is your direct experience, your direct sensory experience, before you have the thought about it, before you have a label or interpretation or concept about it. And I find that distinction of direct experience and kind of conceptual experience like very, very interesting, and something that's quite difficult to untangle for people, it seems.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, because we hadn't really talked about this before, or at least like before this episode, but it's interesting to see that my notes are very, very similar to like how you would describe it as well. I see, yeah, the process that's really being talked about is, you know, we have this sense data, like I see it as like raw input of just everything that's being experienced. And it is just sights and smells and sounds, feelings, taste, all of that. And what happens is we turn that into a narrative. So we turn it into like, I'm in a room, I'm thinking about this, there's a microphone here, there's a laptop, and you construct this narrative. And this narrative is something that runs through your entire life. And how I understand it, or how I think about it, is that this narrative that you create is what your mind and your unconscious uses to make predictions about the future, because it's got an idea of like what it thinks has happened or what things mean, and it uses that narrative that's been created based on trying to parse the data of your direct experience and trying to understand what is going on around you. And that data, it turns into a narrative, which is, you know, what enables us to be able to interact with other people and to distinguish foreground from background and see that there is a difference between your laptop and what is behind it, because we're creating this story about it and these thoughts that come in to explain whatever is there, whatever's being experienced.
And I think this is one of those areas that, you know, it can be quite easy to just be like, so what? You know, I think about things, I have my interpretations of things, like, what's the problem? Like, why does this quote exist? Why has Adyashanti actually emphasized this insight? And it's because there is, as you said, like it's obviously very important that we have interpretations and concepts for things to navigate. Like, we can't just be like a newborn, just like totally in awe of everything that's happening, or like we can't just be totally absorbed by our raw sensory experience, sight, sound, smell, etc., and not have any interpretations of it, because you can't function like this. You're not actually able to function in that state, really. However, the reason why it's important to kind of reflect on this is to make sure that you don't forget that your raw sense experience, the actual input that's going on, that really is the foundation of life. That is really the most pure, true thing that's actually happening in your life, in the present moment, the only thing that exists. That's the foundation, and the rest is interpretation, and the rest is concept. That's a really fundamental thing to recognize, because I know in my experience, and I imagine in the majority of the human race's experience, I take my concepts and interpretations to be completely true and real, solid, and just as valuable and true as my sense experience, like as the foundational experience that I'm having. Like I'll take my thought that, you know, just to kind of highlight this. So I'll take my thought of you, George, and who you are to be real, to be a real thing. It's completely fictitious. It's not, it may be somewhat accurate in predicting what you're going to do and how you generally act. But if I take my interpretation of you to be completely real, I'm totally limiting you as a person. You know, I'm confining you, I'm setting expectations for you, and I'm unable to see you fully. I'm unable to experience you fully because I've confined you into a very tight, restricted idea of who you are. So I'm actually imprisoning you within my own concept of who you are. So essentially I'm objectifying you in a way. If I go purely with thought, if I go just pure kind of pure concept of George, then I'm not able to really perceive who you are as in your full humanity. It's not possible because it's totally thought-based, totally based on what you've done in the past, totally based on my own biases, because, you know, like, I like you, and so I'm going to see you in a particular way. I'm not, you know, I'm not going to be able to accurately view who you are. Like, all of these things are it's all just based on my past experience of who you are. And so that is extremely limiting. And I'm doing that for almost everything. Something very interesting happens when you start relating to, when you start seeing through these concepts as being helpful tools, but not ultimately real, as being quite transparent. They're not actually ultimately like a truth. The fact that I've interpreted something in a certain way, and instead coming back to what we know is true, what these kind of my foundational sense experience. If I come back to that and I'm really able to be with that, then my experience of life starts to shift. I'm able to see things much more accurately, and I'm much more free to be open and receptive to what is actually happening. So yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to say on that.
No, that's good. I think one thing that I was thinking of with this quote was how I was just trying to really go through the process. I was just sat down and trying to experience what is before having the thought about it. And I was also then thinking of essentially what's happening is there's an experience, and as soon as you try and describe that experience, that moment has gone, because you're in a different moment trying to describe the moment and try and quantify that moment, but you're no longer in it. And the thing that gets even more trippy is when it gets into essentially a feedback loop, because your thoughts, they exist in the same realm as external sounds. You have internal sounds of your dialogue and monologue, but you have, you know, external sounds of a car passing by or whatever. And those thoughts are in the same field of experience. So those thoughts can also be what is before you have a thought about that thought, and before you start. And that's just a weird nature of how we're kind of like straddling this knife edge of the present moment. And when we're trying to, as soon as we try and capture it, we're not in it. And you can't really describe being in it, because you're describing how it was to be in it when you were. But that moment of you describing it is also it until you try and talk about it. So you just end up in a feedback loop, which can be quite entertaining, I suppose. But yeah, this is the same way that you end up having thoughts about your thoughts. So you can have, you know, you can have it in a metacognition sort of way where you're say meditating and you're becoming aware that you're thinking, and you start to notice your thoughts, because those thoughts are what is, and then you're having thoughts about that. But also it can happen in a way where you're not aware that you're thinking. You're just following a train of thought, and, you know, the next thing you think is related to what you were thinking before, and it kind of just continues like that in cycles of you kind of elaborating on what just happened and going off what was now. Yeah, I thought there was a little thing that I like thought to myself that kind of made me chuckle, which was, as soon as you think about what is, it isn't. For some reason I've had that like going around my head.
Well, yeah, that's what this quote is saying, really. What is what's happening before you have a thought about it. As soon as you have a thought about it, then
it isn't.
You know, then it isn't.
Yeah.
Just because I've really come across this confusion in this area from lots of people previously, I just want to kind of come back to a few other examples of this in practice, so it doesn't end up being because I think it's one of those things that me and you have an experience of, and so we can do that thing of just like building on top of that shared experience that we already have, you know. But I do think it is one of those, this subject of what is before thought is like, is such a head fuck. And it's like, if it's intellectualized, if it comes from a conceptual place, it makes no sense, you know. It's not able to be captured in that way because it is an experiential thing. You know, you actually have to experience what it's like to live pre-thought in some instances, to be like, oh shit, that's what's happening somehow. So it's an experience. An example that I had from last week was that I was doing some workshops on Buddhism at a secondary school, and this was a really interesting thing because this is really what happens very often. So one of the questions that we were asking the students was, how does it feel in your body when someone says something mean to you? When someone says something deliberately hurtful towards you, how does that feel in the body? The replies from all the students were variations on, I feel like that's kind of their problem. If they've said something mean, I feel like that's kind of their problem and it's not my problem. It was something along those lines. It's like, as my interpretation of someone being mean is that it's got nothing to do with me. That's actually their problem. And that was pretty much what all the students would say. We did like multiple workshops and all the students would say a variation on that. And it's quite interesting thinking of where that narrative's come from, because I don't think when we were at school that the majority of the kids would have said that. But that was basically what they were saying, right? And then it was a case of being like, okay, that's a thought. That's an interpretation of why they've been mean. But what does it feel like in the body when someone is mean to you? And that was the interesting thing. So their reply was an interpretation of what was going on, why it was going on. It's a thought. There's a story about what's going on. They're trying to be self-protective. They're trying to make themselves feel better or understand the situation. But that is not direct experience. That's not your direct experience of what's going on. How I feel in my body if someone is mean might sound a little bit more like I feel very contracted in my stomach, or I feel very tight in my chest. You know, I feel like this kind of shrinking sensation. It's a sensation. It's direct experience of sensation. It's not a thought. You can have thought in your direct experience. For example, like if, you know, I'm to say, you know, think of an elephant. You've got an elephant that pops up in your mind and you can have direct experience of that thought. You can't have direct experience of a story. If I tell a whole narrative about walking to school, doing something, that narrative goes across time. And I'm not actually having a direct experience of what happened during that length of time. I'm having a direct experience of thought, of just words and images popping up in my mind. But I'm not actually having a direct experience of this combination of all these thoughts together into an entire story. Just in the same way as I can't have direct experience of my whole laptop, because a laptop's an idea. It's not explaining color or shade or shadow. It's a combination of pieces that I've described as being a laptop. So it's an idea. So I can't have direct experience of a laptop. I can use that as a pointer and have direct experience of this kind of metal and elements, but the laptop itself is a story. That's like it's just like you might say a university, you can't have direct experience of university because a university is a concept for a number of different buildings and people doing and acting in a certain way and being educated in a certain way. But you can't have a direct experience of a university because that is a conceptual model. I'm very, very curious. If you're listening and this clicks for you, I'd really love to know. And if it doesn't, I'd really love to know also, because it's such a weird kind of riddle thing to really come back to what direct experience actually is. And I've seen it many times, even on retreat and things, where someone's asked a question about looking into their direct experience of something, their feeling sense in the body, or the sense of sound, or the sense of vision, and they're answering with a conceptual model. They're not looking into what's going on. They're answering with a pre-made conceptual model of something, which that's not direct experience. And so I find it very interesting as to what that flip is, because it is a bit like a riddle, I think. And when you got it, you're like, oh shit, that's it. But before that is quite confusing. So yeah.
It's interesting because we've talked about this stuff a lot together, and I've thought about it a lot, but I haven't spent too much time trying to like explain it to other people. Like I've had a few conversations here and there, some with people who've, you know, already come to understand this, and some people who haven't, but it's never been like someone who didn't understand it spoke to me and then they did understand it. So
yeah.
So yeah, and it's cool to hear you try and talk through it, because you've had a bit more experience in that than me. It's a very interesting area and a strange one to talk about, because just the language for how to talk about it, and it is not quite right, and you have to use lots of metaphors, and it's really about pointing. You're trying to point to something, to like an experience, but all we're doing now is we're trying to describe direct experience in a conceptual way, because that's the only way we can do it. That's the best that we can offer, because you know you can only experience your own direct experience, and all we can do is try and use metaphors and concepts and explain what it might be like, or give examples. But yeah, it's something that you've got to experience and explore for yourself.
Yeah, and it's not a having direct experience, you know, it's not a state, and it's not anything special. It's something that right now is going on very naturally. If you have an experience of the inside of your body and a sense of contraction or relaxation, it's direct experience. If you have a sense of what it feels like for your feet touching the floor right now, it's direct experience. If you have you're listening to this on headphones or through a speaker, the sound is hitting your eardrums. It's like there's a sense of sound. Direct experience. Your vision, you're having direct experience right now. It's just what I think the difficulty is discerning what is and what isn't direct experience. Like if someone says to you, like, how are you feeling right now, or how does it feel in your body in this moment, you might say, you might even say something like, I feel bored. Right? You might be like, yeah, that's how I feel bored. It's not direct experience. That boredom isn't a sensation in the body. It's you can't directly experience boredom in that way. Boredom is an idea of what's happening, like a sense of resistance, a sense of like, I want something else to be happening. So it's like trying to figure out like what is and what isn't direct experience. And the reason why that's important is that having a relationship, being able to see that distinction, means that it's a lot easier to notice when you're really in touch with what is actually happening, with what is this real, so like the actual terrain of your life, like what's happening in your senses, to know the difference between that and a mental construct that you've made. And like obviously there is physical pain, things like that, but the majority of suffering comes from mental constructs of what's happening. An idea that something's going to happen in the future, something that's going to that has happened in the past, etc. Projections of what's happening. None of it is direct experience. It's ideas of what's happening at other points. So having the ability to be able to come back to your real direct sense of what's going on, that's also having the ability and the skill to be able to unhook and detach from really unhelpful stories and see that they're not real. They're not intrinsically real. Thoughts are real. Thoughts definitely happen, but the stories in thoughts, made by thoughts, are not real. They're not actually, they don't have they're not fundamentally true, solid, fixed things that have their own reality outside of awareness. that bad things are going to happen, whatever. They are ideas. So having the ability to come into direct experience is just one of those life skills that like is it's you're dealing with the real like crux of suffering when you're looking into direct experience and what your conceptual ideas are. So that's the importance of it, really. It can get a little bit kind of like airy fairy, like spiritual things, like you're just what's really sense experience, what's really thought, and it's like, actually no, this is like dealing with your psychology, your very fundamental interpretation of life. You're dealing with suffering itself right at its root. Like this shit is like incredibly important stuff. Actually, it really is like your core experience of being alive as a human being. So it's not just like a fun kind of psychological kind of game, you know. It's like these. Anyway, I'm waffling, but yeah.
No, that was awesome, man. I think that was like a great explanation of it and how powerful it can be. And I've had similar experience of it in my own life, and I think it really is a very important life skill. It's definitely made my life better, and it's just so useful to be able to do. So that seems like a great place to move on to the next quote, if you're ready.
I am ready.
So the next one is another Alan Watts quote, and it is, "Words can be communicative only between those who share similar experiences." Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. If you've got any thoughts about this, and like Oscar was saying in the episode, it'd be really interesting to hear your experience of this episode, like if things made sense or didn't make sense or whatever, because it's something that I'm sure we're going to end up touching on again, and it's nice to get better at explaining it and understand which things resonate and which things don't. And yeah, that would just be cool to hear from you guys. So you can do that on our Instagram, which is knowwhatimean.podcast, and you can send us an email at the link down in the description. So thanks a lot for listening. Please do share this if you found this helpful and something that you'd like to spread to your friends. And have a good week. We'll see you next week. Peace.
See you next week.